So now it's time to dive into functions. And interestingly enough, we're going to cover the functions chapter before we dive into objects and arrays. Now we're doing this because when we deal with objects and arrays, we are dealing with data structures. Now we need functions essentially to be able to mutate or change those data structures. So this is why we're doing functions ahead of arrays and objects. Now, it's difficult to teach something in JavaScript without showing another concept, and we've kind of looked at functions already. We even have our getElementById. This is a function as well. So what we want to cover in this video is to understand the three ways that we can create a function. Now, for this, what we're going to do is leave a comment for each style of function so we understand where we're going. Now, the first way is called a function declaration. This typically looks something like this, where we start with that function keyword, and then we have to give it an identifier. Much like we give a variable, either a var, a let, or a const, we have to give it some unique identifier. Now, for the purposes of this chapter, we're going to make a particular type of car. So this is how we define a function. We say the function keyword, and then followed by that identifier. Now, you may have heard before, if you're an experienced JavaScript developer, that functions are just objects as well. And this is completely true. We can add properties, we can do anything we like that we also have the ability to do with an object. Now, the difference between an object and a function is what we call callable. So if we look a little bit further at the syntax, we can add this curly brace to the end of our function. Now, in the next chapter, we'll know that we need these curly braces to define an object, but we also need them here. Now, the real difference between a function and an object is, like I said, a function is callable. And you can see up here, this getElementById, we have these normal brackets, these parentheses, and they're exactly how we define a function. So we add this piece here after our function identifier, that keyword, after we make this declaration. And now this function will exist in the scope of this document. So inside of here, we've been using console log throughout the course. So inside, we'll go ahead and we'll give a small indication that something is happening. So here we can say that we are making a car. So when I hit save, we're actually seeing an error because we're not calling the function. You can see here that ESLint is saying make car is defined, but it's never used. Now, it's not illegal syntax. We can purely have functions that exist in our code base that we never use. It might be that you're using a library or an external project that has lots of functions and functionality inside it that you might never use. However, that code may still exist in the project. But it's a good practice, and I like ESLint in this sense because it informs us that we're actually writing code that is never used, and that all adds up to bytes that are sent over the network, and they can all trim down our JavaScript bundle size. So now we understand the key components, this function keyword, followed by our identifier. We add this syntax, which looks like a callable kind of object. So how do we actually go ahead and call the function? All we need to simply do is reference our identifier, much like we would access a variable, and then we just simply call these parentheses afterwards. So when we hit save again, all the errors will disappear, and our function has now been called. We are now making that car. Now we could also console log the make car itself, and you'll see here that this has been converted to a string for us so we can see what the function in fact looks like. So that's another useful tip for you. So now we've looked at the first way, let's have a look at the second way. Now the second way is called a function expression. So it's slightly different, but it follows a similar pattern, and it's totally up to you which style you prefer. If you're creating just generic functions, this tends to be the style of the function that I like to use. It's very clear and obvious, and it doesn't make things look too verbose. Now, a function expression is slightly different. We could say something like a const. We're going to call this the make car expression. This is then simply going to take the value of a function. So up here we have function, we have the keyword, and we could essentially just take this whole thing and paste it on the end. So this is what we know as a function expression. Now, you do not necessarily need this make car keyword, so we could remove this entirely. Now, what this piece here is specifically called is an anonymous function. Now, it's anonymous because essentially we just removed that make car name, so the function technically doesn't have a name. Now, you may be wondering, if you wanted to try out something like this, is this a valid piece of JavaScript? Now, you can already see that there's a red underline here, so we have an unexpected token. This means that you cannot create functions without a name. We need this name keyword to exist here, such as ABC. So that's a valid function. Now, if we want to bind a function expression, this is completely valid. We know it's called an anonymous function. So before we go any further, let's just log out our make car expression. Now, something interesting here is when we hit dot, you should see some nice auto completion going on. Now, this is similar to looking at the prototype like we've done in other videos. And here you can see we have .call, we have caller, length, name, and the prototype and toString. So let's go ahead and log out this name property. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you would want to access the name of your particular function, and this will absolutely work with this make car example, so we could log this out and just show you that. So here you see that the make car example works perfectly fine as well. So sometimes I've had this in the past, I have wanted to know what the function name is. So that's a nice useful tip for you if you want to access that at all. Now, another variation of this function expression is the named function expression. And that's pretty much what we've already covered. So if I decided that I did want to give this anonymous function a name, when we actually save and update this, we see this make car expression. So we're logging out the name of this function. Now, this is an important and interesting piece of information. If we were to rename this, and for ease, I'll just call it my function. If you watch over here, our .name now actually is picked up from the function name here, and it doesn't default back to our constant keyword. Now, again, I'm using a constant here because it's good practice. We're not going to reassign it. You can completely use let, you can completely use var, but as we know, const is a safer way. We don't want to pointlessly use var or let. So that's two ways. This is the function expression, and I'll add some notes here for you, anonymous or named. So this is the named function expression, and this is the anonymous version. So this leads us to our third item. Now, this is called an arrow function. Now, the arrow functions differ, and they are a very, very good addition to the language. Arrow functions, in fact, landed in ES 2015. So, in fact, they are quite a recent addition. Now, an arrow function we cannot use in this style of syntax. An arrow function would happen when we have some kind of function expression. And as we look at things such as arrays and objects, we'll be showing you more in detail how these all come together. Now, let's have a look, and we'll call this the make car arrow. Now, an arrow function starts off the similar way. So up here we had that expression where we equals and then assign a value of a function. Now, an arrow function is just a different style of function. So interestingly enough, an arrow looks like this, and then we in fact create what looks like an arrow and then the body of the function. From a syntax perspective, our functions have arguments, and we're going to be covering these in the next few videos. But if you're somewhat familiar with functions, or you're perhaps new to arrow functions, they don't act in very different ways. They're predictable in the sense that arguments are still passed as parameters, and we have a typical body of a function such as this. So let me just go ahead and demonstrate. We can add a new console log, and we can say making car inside the arrow. Now, underneath this, we can make car arrow, and then simply just go ahead and call that function. We'll save these out, and you can see that we have this being printed out below. Now, when it comes to talking about the this keyword in JavaScript, it's something that we haven't quite covered just yet, but we'll be exploring it later on in this chapter. We'll be looking at the way the this keyword differs between functions and also arrow functions. So that's something just to keep in mind once we get there. Now, there's also something really interesting with an arrow function, is because we can create a shorthand version. So here I'm going to say make car arrow shorthand, And what we're going to do is say console log short. So let's go ahead and make car arrow shorthand and just invoke that function. Now this was a really nice addition to the language because unlike our function declarations up here, unlike our anonymous functions, the arrow functions essentially make this whole piece here that's highlighted almost completely optional, especially when we want to use it as just an anonymous callback. Now we also get this piece here, which is omitted. So you can see here, we have the console log inside, and then inside here, there's no curly braces. So we can, in fact, omit that if we want to. Now, use cases for this are the just nice shorthand one-liners. Kind of think about when we used the ternary statement earlier in this course. Try and think about it like that. We don't want to use shorthand arrow functions for absolutely everything because it becomes quite impossible to read if you had thousands of lines of code. So keep it sensible and use some sensible approaches. There's also one interesting thing, and we'll come onto this when we look at function returns. But if you're somewhat experienced with JavaScript, we have things such as a return statement where I could return perhaps 1, 2, 3. Now in an arrow function, this is called an implicit return. So this is essentially returning our console log here. Now that's just a quick piece of information, and once we get onto understanding function return statements in the next few videos, we'll understand this behavior in a bit more detail. Now the final thing that I want to show you is when we looked at the beginning of this course, we looked at the let keyword and how you cannot access it above, and this is due to something called hoisting. So let's scroll back up to the top and let's try and see the behavior of how we can access these functions. So let's talk to make car. Let's also talk to make car expression. Let's also add the make car arrow, and finally the arrow shorthand. So all of these, you can see that there is no red underlines. If we were to spell something incorrectly, then we do get that red underline. So ESLint knows that they exist, but when we hit save, what are we going to see up here? So let's save this out and have a look. So the only one that we in fact see is our function declaration. If you have a look at our const, we have 3 constants, our make car expression, make car arrow, and the arrow shorthand, and we cannot call these before the point of where they are defined. So this behavior is called hoisting, and we looked at this with our variables as I just mentioned as well. So the rule here is that the function declarations are perfectly hoisted. You can start using them wherever you like. However, these kind of play with an older style of JavaScript where we may have lots of files that get loaded and the functions are hoisted to the top of the scope so we can access them anywhere. Now, later on in this course, we'll be talking about JavaScript modules, and you'll see there how this problem has been fixed, it's been solved, so we can make more of a use of things like functions expressions and arrow functions should we want to. But that's for later on in this course. So this is a good primer so far. We've covered the 3 ways that we can declare a function, the function declaration and expressions, and also those arrow functions. So let's move on to talking about function parameters and their defaults.